The morning the court was summoned to hear the decree, the long gallery of Marinost smelled of cold beeswax and rain, and Marisabel Quillane stood at the foot of the dais in the grey gown she had worn to her own quiet wedding, listening to a clerk read aloud the unmaking of her marriage. She did not weep. She had been raised in a parsonage where weeping was a private act, and she would not give the assembled lords that small coin to carry away her hands, folded at her waist, were perfectly still. Only the pulse at her throat moved, a quick fluttering beat beneath the worn lace of her collar, and no one, in that gilded room, thought to look there. The clerk's voice was thin and careful. He spoke of a prior contract, of an impediment lately discovered, of the regrettable necessity by which the union of His Majesty and the lady was declared null from its beginning, as though it had never been, as though it had never been. The phrase moved through the gallery like a draught, and the lords received it the way lords receive weather, with composed faces and watchful eyes already calculating what the change of season meant for them. At the top of the dais sat the man who had married her in a chapel by candlelight 9 months before, and who now looked at the floor between them as if a chasm had opened there. King Alaric of Valemont was 34 years old, tall and dark, and so disciplined in his bearing that the stillness of him could be mistaken for indifference by anyone who did not know the price he paid for it. He did not look at her. That was the cruelty she had not braced for, not the words, the averted eyes. What the gallery did not know, what not one of those watchful lords could have guessed from her plain gown and her folded hands, was that beneath the grey wool, Marisabel carried his child. She had known it 3 weeks. She had meant to tell him on a quiet evening, the way she had imagined it through the autumn, his hand finding the news before his ears did. Napped. Instead, she had been summoned here to stand below him while a clerk unmade her, and she had folded the secret away inside herself, like a letter she could not yet send, to the court of Marinost. She had never been more than a parson's daughter the king had married, in a season of grief, an unaccountable lapse soon to be corrected. That was the verdict the room had reached, long before the clerk drew breath. She heard it now in the rustle of silk as the ladies turned to one another, in the small, satisfied settling of skirts, the girl from the parsonage, the marriage that should never have happened, set right at last. She did not understand, in that first grey hour, how the months ahead would turn. She knew only that she must walk the length of the gallery without faltering, past the lords and the ladies and the cold high windows, and out through the doors a wife, and into the rain a woman with no name the law would honor. So she did. One step, and then the next, and the count of the stones beneath her shoes was the only ledger she kept that morning. To understand how a parson's daughter came to stand below a king and hear herself unmade, you must go back to the spring before, to the small grey church at Halvane, where her father had held the living for 30 years. Marisabel had grown up among hymn books and the smell of damp stone, the eldest of 3, her mother long in the churchyard, her hands early acquainted with the work of a house that ran on little. She was 24 that spring, with a kind of quiet that strangers mistook for shyness, and her father knew to be a deep and watchful self-possession. She read Latin he had taught her, and Greek she had taught herself. She kept the parish accounts in a hand so clean, the bishop's man once asked who the clerk was. The king came to Halvane to bury his brother. That was the whole of it, in the beginning. The younger prince had died of a fever, taken on the northern roads, and by some old courtesy of the family he was laid in the Valemont vault beneath the very church where Marisabel's father served, a vault sealed 2 generations and open now in the rain. She was in the church when the king came arranging the white roses her father could not afford, and had grown himself against the south wall. She did not know who the tall man in the dark coat was, until he stood beside her at the chancel rail and said, in a voice level and low, that the roses were the only honest thing in the building. She might have curtsied and fled. A wiser girl would have. Instead, she said that honesty was cheaper than marble and kept better, and she watched something move behind his eyes that she would spend a long time trying to name. He stayed 3 days at Halvane while the masons did their work. He came each morning to the church. They spoke of his brother and of grief. and then, by degrees of everything else, in the plain, unhurried way of two people who have each decided privately that the other is worth the truth. When he left, he took her hand at the door and held it a moment longer than courtesy allowed, and she felt the cold of his glove and the warmth of his grip through it, and she understood that her life had tilted on its axis and would not right itself again. He came back in the summer. He had no business at Halvane, and he invented none, which was its own kind of confession. They walked the lane between the hedgerows where the cow parsley stood as high as her shoulder, and he told her, with the difficulty of a man unused to wanting anything he could not command, that he had buried more than his brother in that vault. He had buried the last of his belief that a king might be permitted an honest hour, and then he had come to a church in the rain and found a woman arranging roses, and the belief had stirred again, and he could not bury it a second time. They were married in September in the chapel at Marinost, by candlelight, with 2 witnesses and the king's old chaplain, and no announcement to the lords until the thing was done. Marisabel had asked for nothing grander. She did not want a crowd to watch her become a queen. She wanted only the man, and the small, fierce privacy of his choosing her. What she did not know, walking up that candle-lit aisle in a gray gown, was that 2 doors away, a woman sat at a writing desk, already composing the letters that would unmake her. That woman was Ismene, the Dowager Queen, the king's mother, and she had ruled the court of Marinost in all but name, through the long years of her son's silence. She was 61 years old, upright as a chancel candle, with white hair dressed close beneath a widow's cap, and eyes the pale gray of a winter river. She wore mourning, still, 11 years after the old king's death, because mourning was authority, and she had learned young to wear authority like a second skin. She had spent those 11 years arranging her son's grief into something useful, and she had chosen, with great care, the woman he would eventually marry. That woman was not a parson's daughter from Halvane. The dowager said nothing cruel to Marisabel in those first weeks. That was the thing about her that the young queen came slowly to understand. She was never cruel. In a way one could name aloud. She was unfailingly correct. She inquired after the parish at Halvane in a tone that placed it precisely, a small wet living, in a county no one of consequence had visited. She admired Marisabel's command of accounts as one might admire a clever servant. She seated her always exactly where rank required, and never an inch above it, and she let the court draw its own conclusions from the arithmetic of the table. But the conclusion the court drew, the dowager voiced once herself, in a private aside Marisabel was not meant to hear and heard. It was late, in the long drawing-room, and the older woman was speaking to her companion of the season's disappointments. "The king has indulged a sentiment," she said, "and a sentiment is a thing one indulges, and then sets aside as one sets aside black for gray." She did not lower her voice quite enough. Marisabel, at the window with her embroidery, kept her needle moving, and her face composed, and she felt the words settle into her like cold water into wool, slow and thorough, and impossible to wring out. She did not tell the king. She had learned in a house of small means that some weights are carried better in silence, and she did not want to make him choose. In those first bright months between his wife and his mother, she thought there was time. She thought love would prove the longer argument. What she did not yet know was that the dowager had already found the instrument by which a marriage could be lawfully dissolved, and was even then having it made ready, with a patience that would have frightened Marisabel far more than any open cruelty. The instrument was a contract. The dowager produced it in October, before the Privy Council, with the grave reluctance of a woman performing an unwelcome duty. It was an old paper, foxed and creased, bearing the seal of a noble house and a date some years past, and it set out a betrothal between His Majesty and a lady of that house, made in the late king's lifetime and never formally dissolved. A pre-contract, the canon lawyers call it, an impediment of the gravest kind. For if the king had been promised before God to one woman, then his marriage to another was no marriage at all, but a thing void from its first breath, and any issue of it base-born. The lady named in the contract was Carzand, daughter of the Marquess of Burcliffe, and she sat in the council chamber while the paper was read with her eyes lowered and her color high. A woman of 27 who had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and who had waited with the patience of the entitled for the world to arrange itself around that correctness. She was handsome in the cold, polished way the court admired, and she had been raised to a throne the way other girls are raised to a pianoforte, as a skill to be perfected and then displayed. She did not look at Marisabel either. There was, the young queen thought, a great deal of not looking in the palace of Marinost. The king fought it. Marisabel knew that much, though she was not in the chamber. She knew it from the candles burning past midnight behind the council doors, from the gray exhaustion in his face when he came at last to her rooms and stood at the window with his back to her, unable to say the words. He had summoned every canon lawyer in the kingdom, and 3 from beyond it. He had demanded the contract, examined the seal tested, the witnesses found, and the contract had held. The seal was genuine. A witness yet living, an old steward of the Breckliff house, swore to having seen it made. Hey, against a sworn witness and a true seal, the king of Ailmont, who could raise armies and pardon murderers, was powerless. To keep one parson's daughter for his wife. I will ask you to sit with that a moment. The way she had 2, a man who held the whole machinery of a kingdom in his 2 hands, and the one thing he wanted, he could not hold. Now let the story carry you forward, because she did not yet know what you are about to learn, and the not knowing was the heaviest part. He told her on a Tuesday, in the gray light before the decree was public, that the law would unmake them, and he could not stop it. He did not tell her he had stopped fighting. He had not. Marisabel, though, watching his still face and his averted eyes, read, "Surrender where there was only exhaustion." And the misreading was the seed of everything that followed. She did not tell him about the child. How could she thought, when the law was about to declare any child of theirs baseborn? She would not have him torn that way. She folded the secret, smaller, and said only that she understood, and asked in a voice she kept level by main force where she was to go. He had arranged it carefully, which she later understood was the only language of love left available to him. A house at the edge of the Marinost grounds, a small stone manor called Pelham Lodge, with a garden and a wall and a competence settled on her for her life, given in a manner the law could not touch because it was given as charity to a gentlewoman of reduced circumstance and not as provision to a wife. He had thought of everything, except how to look at her while he did it. When she left the gallery that morning, the decree read, "The marriage unmade." She walked out into the rain, and a footman held an umbrella over her she had not asked for, and she got into a plain carriage and was driven the short cold distance to the lodge that would be, she believed, the whole remainder of her life. The court decided within the week what she had been. To the season, she was now the king's regrettable error, a kindness done and a kindness withdrawn, a woman who had reached above her station and been gently returned to it. The phrase passed at card tables and in carriage windows. Lady Coruscant was seen at the dowager's right hand at every supper, and the betrothal that the old contract had revived was spoken of as a settled thing, a wedding to be celebrated in the spring, and the parson's daughter at Pelham Lodge was not spoken of at all, which is a particular kind of erasure the high reserve for the inconvenient. Marisabel did not waste the winter morning. That was not in her. She set the small household of the lodge in order. 2 servants the king's charity provided, a cook named Winifred at Coyle, with a sharp tongue and a kind hand, and a manservant, who tended the garden and the fires. She kept her accounts. She wrote to her father at Halvane, a letter that told him she was well, and told him nothing else, because the something else was not yet a thing she could put into a letter that might be read by other eyes. And she waited for the spring, when the child would come, and she turned over in her mind, in the long, quiet evenings, the single question that would not leave her. How had a pre-contract she had never heard of, to a lady the king had never spoken of, surfaced so precisely in the hour it was needed? She was not a fanciful woman. She did not believe in the convenient. A house run on little teaches you that nothing arrives in the exact hour of its need, unless a hand has placed it there. So she did the thing her father had taught her to do, with a difficult sum. She went back to the beginning and checked the working. And the beginning, the only part of the contract she could examine, was its date. The contract was dated the spring of a year some 7 years past, made it said in the late king's lifetime at the Briarcliff house in the north. Marisabel knew almost nothing of the great houses of the kingdom. She knew one thing, however, because she had read it in her father's small library on a winter evening years before, in a book of no importance, that the spring of that year had been the spring of the great northern flood, when the rivers rose and the Briarcliff lands were under water for 3 weeks, and the family had been carried south to Marinost as guests of the old king while their house dried. She knew the year because the book had been a sermon on Providence, and the flood had been its example, and her father had read it aloud to her in the cold parlor, and she had remembered it the way she remembered everything she had ever read. The contract said it was made at the Briarcliff seat in the spring of the flood. In that drowned season, however, there had been no one at the northern house to make it. The whole family had been at Marinost, under the old king's roof, while their own stood empty to the rafters in brown water. A paper cannot be made and sealed in a house no one is standing in. The thought arrived whole and cold and certain, and Marisabel sat very still in the lodge parlor, with her hand pressed to the small rise of the child, and understood that the instrument that had unmade her was a forgery, and that she was, perhaps, the only person in the kingdom who had read the one obscure book that could prove it. Proof, though, is not knowledge. She knew it. She could not yet prove it. A sermon read years ago in a country parlor was not evidence a privy council would hear from the mouth of a discredited woman. She needed the date of the flood fixed beyond her own remembering, in a record no one could wave away, and she needed someone to carry it whose word the court could not simply refuse to hear. She had neither. That winter, sitting in a borrowed house with a child quickening inside her. What she had was the truth, and a great deal of patience, and the slow turning of a careful mind that had been underestimated by everyone in Marinost for precisely as long as it had suited them to underestimate it. She began with the doctor. The king's charity had sent her a physician for her confinement, an elderly man named Marable, with ink-stained fingers, and a habit of speaking to her as an equal, which, in that winter, was a gift beyond price. Dr. Marable had served the Valemont house 40 years. He had been at Marinost in the spring of the flood. And when Marisabel, pouring his tea one gray afternoon, asked him idly whether it was true the Briarcliff family had once sheltered at the palace during some great inundation, the old man set down his cup and told her the whole of it without suspecting why she asked. The year, the 3 weeks, the Marquis complaining of the river every night at supper, the young lady Corisande, then a child frightened of the rising water. Every soul of that house under the old king's roof, from the thaw to the feast of the patron saint, while their own stood empty, in the flood. She had her witness now, though he did not know it, and she had begun to assemble the rest with the quiet method of a woman keeping accounts. The flood was a public calamity. It would be in the records of the cathedral chapter, in the tax remissions granted the drowned counties, in the very rolls of the realm. A forged betrothal made in an empty house could be undone by the simple, unanswerable fact of where its supposed makers had been. Marisabel, for all that, could not walk into the cathedral chapter and demand the rolls. A woman in her position would be turned away at the gate, gently and finally, and the dowager would learn within the hour that the parson's daughter was asking dangerous questions. And the records would develop, she did not doubt, an unfortunate gap. The dowager was not a careless adversary. That winter taught Marisabel as much. Word came to the lodge, by way of Winifridi, who had it from the village, that the old steward of the Briarcliff house, the one living witness who had sworn to the contract's making, had been settled comfortably in a cottage on the dowager's own land, well fed and well watched, and that 2 of the dowager's men were lodged in the village by the cathedral for no purpose anyone could name. The dowager had not forged a paper and then forgotten it. She had forged it, and set a guard upon every road that led back to the forging. The witness was housed where no one could reach him. The watchers sat by the records. She had thought, as a clever and frightened woman thinks of every door, and she had locked them all. All but one. And the one she had not thought to lock was the one Marisabel had been born to. The dowager guarded the cathedral and the steward and the great rolls of the realm, the places a great lady would think to look. It did not occur to her that the drowned spring was written also in the humblest record in the kingdom, the parish register of a small grey church, where every birth and burial and act of God was set down in a careful hand, for no eyes but God's and the bishop's. The flood had drowned country parishes the length of the northern river. Every one of them would have entered it, the rising water, the ruined glebe, the burials delayed. And Marisabel's own father had once held a northern living, before Halvain, in a parish on the very river that ran past the Brearcliff lands, in the years when the contract claimed to have been made. She wrote to her father. Not the careful empty letter of the autumn. A long one, by candlelight, that told him everything. The child and the forgery and the date of the flood, and the register she needed, and she sent it not by the public post, which the dowager's men might watch, but by Dr. Marrable's own servant, who was going north to his daughter's wedding and thought he carried only a daughter's love to her father. And then she waited, through the deepening winter, with the child growing heavy in her, and the spring wedding of the king and Lady Coruscant drawing nearer, and she held the truth inside her like a second life, and let no one in Marinost see that she held anything at all. It was Winifridi who carried the worst of the court's voice into the lodge, not from cruelty, but because she judged her mistress the kind of woman who would rather know. She came in from the village one frost-bright morning with the marketing, and set it down and said plainly what Lady Coruscant had been heard to say at the dowager's table the night before. She says you were never a wife, Winifrida told her. Only a mistake His Majesty made in his grief a parson's girl who reached above her station and has been put back below it. Marisabel thanked her and went on shelling the dried peas into the bowl, and her hands did not falter, and only the cook, who had borne 3 children of her own, saw how carefully the younger woman breathed. The king came to the lodge once that winter. She had not expected him and was not ready, and she opened the door herself to find him standing in the snow without escort. A king arrived like a poacher at the edge of his own grounds. He did not come in. He stood on the step and looked at her, and his eyes went against all his discipline, to the unmistakable change in her figure, and the color left his face entirely. She watched him understand. She watched the calculation arrive, the count of the months, the certainty of whose child she carried, and she watched the grief of it nearly bring a king to his knees. On a snowy step he had thought he was protecting her from one cruelty. He had not known there was a child to be made baseborn by the law. He had failed to break. She let him stand there a long moment in the cold. Then she said, the one true sentence she had not been able to say in the gallery, the sentence she had carried since October, and she said it plainly because plainness was the only dignity left to either of them. You set aside your wife, she told him, and your son with her, and neither of us was yours to set aside, because the paper that unmade us was made in a house that stood empty under water. She did not weep saying it. He did. A king wept on the step of a borrowed lodge, and the snow came down between them, and for the first time since the gallery, he looked at her, fully, the way he had looked at a woman arranging roses in a church in the rain, and she saw that he had never surrendered her at all. He had only believed the law had taken her, and grief had made him a man who could not lift his eyes. He wanted to act at once. That was the king in him, the man who raised armies and pardoned murderers. He would go to the council that night, he said, and tear the contract to pieces, and dare them to stop him. And Marisabel, 24, and great with his child, and steadier in that hour than the king of Vailmont, took his cold hand in both of hers, and told him no, a king's fury would change nothing, she said. The seal was genuine. He had proved it, himself. A sworn witness yet lived. If he stormed the council on the strength of his love, they would call it the same sentiment his mother had named, a sentiment indulged and to be set aside, and the contract would stand the stronger for his having failed to break it twice. The forgery could not be shouted down. It could only be proved false by a record the dowager had not thought to guard, in an hour of the dowager's own choosing, before witnesses she could not dismiss. He must be patient. He must let the court believe nothing had changed. He must let his mother bring the matter to its height, and trust his wife, who had kept accounts since she was 12, to balance the sum when the moment came. It was the hardest thing she ever asked of him, and the measure of the man was that he did it. He went back through the snow, and he let the court go on believing the parson's daughter forgotten, and he let his mother's confidence inflate through the lengthening days toward the spring wedding she had arranged, and every nerve in him strained against the waiting. Marisabel knew the cost of it. She had set him a discipline harder than any battle, the discipline of doing nothing while the woman he loved bore his child, alone in a lodge at the edge of his grounds, and the law called that child base. He bore it, and the bearing of it was the proof to her of what he was far more than the candlelit chapel or the roses had ever been. The register came north to south in the last week of Lent, wrapped in oilcloth, and carried by Dr. Marrable's returning servant, who still believed he carried nothing but a father's reply. Marisabel opened it at the parlor table with hands that shook for the first time all winter. Her father had not sent a copy. He had sent the book itself, the actual register of his old northern parish, with the bishop's leave, and a letter in his careful hands directing her to the page. And there it was, in the ink of 14 years past, in the entry of a country curate recording the troubles of his flock. The river risen, the glebe drowned. 3 burials kept above the water in the church porch 11 days because the ground would take no spade. And the great house upriver, the seat of the marquis, stood empty and flooded to the first floor, its family gone south to the king's protection, from the feast of the thaw to the feast of the patron saint. A neutral country hand, 14 years cold, recording for God and the bishop the precise weeks in which the Brarecliff contract claimed its makers, had been at home, in the north, to make it. She had her proof. Now she needed her hour. And the hour, she understood, must be the dowager's own. The wedding the old woman had arranged. The public triumph in the very hall where Marisabel had been, unmade. To prove the forgery in a quiet council chamber would let the dowager retire the matter into silence and house her men by another set of records. It must be done where the whole court watched, where it could not be hushed, where the recognition would be as public as the erasure had been. Marisabel sent 1 letter to the king, 3 lines telling him only to ensure she was admitted to the betrothal feast and to trust her, and to look to the old Brarecliff steward in the same hour. The rest she would carry herself. The child was born in the 2nd week of April, in the grey dawn, with Dr. Marrable and Winifrida Coyle at the bedside, and no herald to announce him to a kingdom that had declared him base before he drew breath. A son? Marisabel held him in the first light, and felt the whole shape of her purpose settle and harden into something she would not now be moved from. She had a fortnight before the wedding. She rose from childbed faster than the doctor liked, because a woman who means to walk into the hall that unmade her cannot do it leaning on another's arm. She left the boy safe at the lodge with Winifrida, well guarded, well loved, no part of the danger, and she had her grey wedding gown let out and pressed. The same gown because she meant the court to know exactly who had walked back in. The betrothal feast of the king and Lady Corisande filled the long gallery of Marinost with light and the whole peerage of the kingdom. The dowager sat at the high table in her widow's black, upright as a chancel candle, and Lady Corisande beside her in cloth of silver, handsome and cold and certain, a woman receiving at last the throne she had been raised to expect. The king sat among them with the face. The court read as resignation, and Marisabel entering at the far doors in her grey gown, read as a held breath. The room saw her and went still in patches, the stillness spreading down the long tables like frost across a pane. And the dowager's pale grey eyes found her across the length of the hall and narrowed, once in the only sign of calculation she permitted herself, before composing again into perfect correctness. She let Marisabel come. That was her error. And it was the error of a woman who had never been refused. She let the parson's daughter walk the length of the gallery, believing no doubt that she came to beg, or to make a scene that would discredit her finally, and either would serve. It was Lady Corisande who spoke, into the spreading hush, in the carrying voice of a woman certain of her audience. "We need not be uncivil to her," she said, looking down the table at the approaching figure, "but I confess I did not think the king's little mistake would have the boldness to walk back in among her betters." A few of the nearer lords laughed the brief, uneasy laugh of people who are not sure the joke is safe. Marisabel walked to the foot of the high table and stopped where she had stopped in October, in the same place, in the same gown, and she did not beg. She set upon the table in the sight of the whole court an old parish register bound in worn calf, and she opened it to the page her father's hand had marked. "The contract that dissolved a marriage in this hall," she said, and her voice was not loud, but the silence carried it to the farthest table, was made by its own date, at the Briarcliff house in the spring of the great northern flood. She let that settle. The Marquess of Briarcliff, at the high table, had gone the color of tallow. In the spring of that flood, she went on, the Briarcliff house stood empty to the first floor, under brown water. Every soul of that family sheltered here, beneath this roof, under the old king's protection, from the feast of the thaw to the feast of the patron saint. She turned the register so the high table could see the page. This is the record of the parish that drowned beneath their windows, kept by a country curate who never heard their names, 14 years before any of us had cause to want it. A paper cannot be sealed in a house that no one is standing in. The contract is a forgery, and every word read in this hall against the marriage was read against a lie. The hall did not erupt. That was not the way of the court of Marinost, and it was not the way of this kind of justice, which arrives not as thunder, but as a slow turning of every head toward the truth, at last made plain. The Marquess rose half from his seat and sat again. Lady Corisande, in her cloth of silver, looked not at Marisabel, but at the dowager beside her, and in that single involuntary turning of her head, the whole court read who had made the paper, for a betrothed bride does not look to her future husband's mother for rescue unless she has always known the bride was a thing the mother arranged. Corisande's color drained. She had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice. She had not known until that moment the price of the correctness, or that it had been bought with a lie she would now be seen to have profited by, and the seeing of it, plain on her face, was the first true thing the court had ever watched her feel. Chill. The dowager did not crumble. She was made of harder material. She rose in her black upright still, and she said in a voice that had ruled the court 11 years, that the register proved nothing but the rambling of a country curate. The dates were easily mistaken, that this was a desperate woman's invention. And here the king rose. He had waited the whole winter for this, and he spent the waiting in a single calibrated stroke, the minimum sufficient, and not one word more. He did not denounce his mother. He did not match her years of patience with a king's fury. He turned to the doors at the side of the hall, and the old steward of the Briarcliff house was brought in. The one living witness, the man the dowager, had housed and watched and trusted, and the king asked him one question only, in the hearing of the court. "In the spring of the great flood," he said, "where did you and your master lodge?" The old man was frightened. He was old, though, and near his account, and the dowager's comfortable cottage weighed less in that hall than the thing he had sworn falsely before God. "Here, your majesty," he said. "We lodged here, at Marinost, the whole of that spring while the house dried. The flood was the worst in my life. I could not have forgot it." And then in the silence that followed, understanding what he had confirmed, the old steward looked at the register on the table, and at the king and at the dowager in her black, and he said, the second sentence that ended it, "The paper I swore to was put before me last autumn, and I was bid to remember its making. I never saw it made. God forgive me, there was no making to see. It was done." Marisabel had not raised her voice once. The court that had decided in October that she was the king's regrettable error sat now in the wreckage of its own certainty, and the recognition moved through the long gallery the way the decree had moved through it half a year before. A draft through gilded air, and this time it carried her name. The dowager stood alone at the high table in the ruin of 11 years' authority, and she did not weep, and she did not rage. She had wagered everything on a paper, and the paper was ash. And she knew the arithmetic of her own defeat better than anyone in the room. She gathered her black skirts with hands that had begun very slightly to tremble, and she looked at her son, and for the length of one breath, the king let her see that he understood she had done it out of a terror she called duty. The terror of a woman who could not let the order she had been raised inside be overturned by a parson's daughter and a child from a country church. He did not humiliate her beyond that breath. He did not need to. The hall had done the rest. The king crossed the gallery. He did not announce a pardon or a restoration or any grand thing the court might have expected. He came down from the high table and the length of the floor that had separated them in October, and he stopped before Marisabel in her gray gown, and he took her hand the way he had taken it at the church door at Halvain 2 springs, before the cold of his glove and the warmth of his grip through it. Then he turned to the court with her hand in his, and he said the only words the moment required, 12 and not one more, in the same hall where the verdict had been read against her. "This is my wife," he said, "and our son is born." The hall heard it. A wife? A son? Not a sentiment indulged and set aside, not an error gently corrected, but a marriage that had never been unmade because the unmaking was a lie, and an heir who had been a king's true son from the first breath he drew at a lodge at the edge of the grounds while the court called him base. The lords rose, not for the dowager's order which had governed them 11 years, but for the parson's daughter who had balanced the sum the whole kingdom had got wrong, and the rising of them was the recognition she had carried the truth toward all winter, arrived at last in the only currency that could spend it, the public sight of the whole court setting her right. The dowager left the hall that night and did not return to it. She was not imprisoned nor disgraced before the law, for the king would not make of his mother a spectacle, and the forgery was quietly retired, and the steward sent home unpunished to die in his own bed. She went north of her own choosing, to a dower house on the cold coast, and she wrote her son one letter in the spring, that he read alone and never spoke of, and whatever correction it contained was a thing between them and not for the court. Lady Corisande married, the following year, a viscount of moderate fortune who admired her cold polish and never learned what it had cost her, and she lived out her life the correct choice for someone smaller than a king, which was perhaps the gentlest displacement the story could have given her. Marisabel did not gloat. It was not in her, and the court, watching to see whether the parson's daughter would now lord her vindication over the ladies who had whispered, found her exactly as she had been, quiet and watchful and unfailingly kind to the servants who poured the wine, and the finding of it did more to seat her in their regard than any triumph could have done. She had demonstrated her worth. She did not need to declare it. The kingdom that had measured her by a small wet living and a plain gown, measured her now by the winter she had spent balancing an impossible sum alone, and found, to its slow astonishment, that it had been wrong about her from the first hour in the gallery. The boy grew up at Marinost, the heir, with his mother's clean hand and his father's level eyes, and he was taught his letters by the same Dr. Marable who had told a young queen the date of a flood over tea, and never known what he gave her. The old steward's confession was sealed in the rolls of the realm, and the forged contract burned in the king's own grate, and these were the records the kingdom kept. They were not, however, the thing Marisabel kept. What she kept was the parish register. She did not give it back to her father, who had a copy made and told her the original was hers by right. She kept it in the small writing room at Marinost, on a shelf where the cathedral might have kept a relic. The worn calf binding, and the country curate's careful hand, and the page that named the weeks of a flood. On the evening of her son's first birthday, with the spring rain at the windows and the fire warm and the boy asleep upstairs, the king found her there with the old book open on her knee, not reading it, only resting her hand flat upon the page the way she had once rested it upon the rise of the child. He sat beside her, and did not speak. After a while she closed the register and set it back upon its shelf, and she turned to him, and the rain came down on the grounds where a lodge stood empty now at the edge of the dark, and that was where the story. Let them rest in the warm room with the worn book on the shelf, and the child asleep above them, and the long winter finally fully behind. If Marysabel's winter moved you, I hope you will sit a moment with how quietly her worth was finally seen, and leave a word if you are so inclined on the moment that stayed with you. It was a gift to keep this vigil through her long season with you, and I am grateful you remained for the warmth at its close.